This episode is brought to you by DAS London, Blockworks' #1 institutional crypto conference where all the top institutions and people in crypto are going to be this March in London, what's becoming maybe the crypto hub of the world. I have a link in the show notes where you can learn more and also a discount code that will get you 10% off. Click the link, find out more, and I'll see you there. What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Lightspeed. Today, we're joined by Liam from Jump and Lucas from Jito. These are two of the smartest devs in the Solana ecosystem. Guys, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, pumped to have you on. I really am a little bit intimidated by the brain power we have in here, and I will include you in that. But we have a lot to talk about today because, Liam, you do a lot of work on Firedancer. Lucas, you work at Jito, who has their own client, but also liquid staking. And I think there's a lot of overlap between you two. And I think the general narrative in Solana right now is a big discussion around fee markets and just what are the optimizations that we need. Liam, I think, though, I just want to start with you. We're in this research chat together, and I try to keep up with all the things you say, and you're just cooking the whole time. I can't keep up. So I'm curious, what is the most important thing to you for Solana right now to optimize? What is top of mind?
Well, I think a lot of the problems are actually general to blockchain as a whole, and they could be generally applied. But I think in particular with Solana, what we have found, or at least kind of once you kind of stare at the data for long enough, what you find is that actually Solana has spare capacity in various places, and some of the bottlenecks are actually imposed by implementation. And so one of the things that kind of we're seeing is that, okay, people want to fix fees. They want to fix the fee markets and all that by adding in new rules, things like this EMA fee proposal, right lock fee proposal that people have been promoting before, we've kind of fixed the implementation, sorted out the bottlenecks, figured out kind of problems that don't involve changing the underlying protocol, right? And so I'll leave it kind of there, but there's a lot of implementation that can get fixed and sorted out, in my mind, before we actually have to go and change the underlying.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree. There's a lot of implementation things that can be fixed, and some of them have been fixed since they were detected a few months ago. Some will hopefully be rolling out in 118 or 119. I think a big one that's top of mind for anyone that's looked inside the validator is a scheduler. There's definitely a lot of work to better prioritize the packets and execute them more efficiently. So Andrew at Solana Labs has built this kind of new scheduler that basically there's a centralized planner. It kind of dispatches work out to these threads. I imagine that's kind of what Liam was referring to, and that the scheduler is the big bottleneck right now. I do think Solana does need base fees. There's definitely a lot of state that's very hot and getting saturated. And I think it makes sense to start talking about those things now and how one could do them. But because I think that's going to be a multi-month process to get everyone to agree on something. There is a lot of juice to squeeze out of the current design. But I do think that Solana will need some type of dynamic resource-based fee at some point.
What do you guys think about the latest proposal by Tao and Tolly on the economic back pressure?
So I can give my thoughts, and they're going to I hope they seem obvious. So I'll start with an example. So, Mert, do you own a car?
Yes.
Do you own a car? Okay. So suppose you wanted to sell me your car, right? You may go to the dealer and try and get a good price for it to sell it to them, and they'll sell it to me later on, or maybe I'll just come to you directly, right, and I'll sell it. But those are two different prices, two totally different kind of parts of the market. But you would still consider that part like a car sale, right? Those are both sales of cars. You're in the car selling market, right? Both of those things are, right? And so I see the same thing in the kind of the same sort of behavior in these kind of transaction fee markets, where you have different ways of actually getting a transaction, landed. You have different participants that you're passing these transactions through, and how they're getting prioritized is kind of way more complicated, right? Than we actually think, right? Than at the outset. right? What we end up seeing and what you end up looking at as, someone who's doing these analyses is that all you end up seeing is the block has some amount of utilization. You see the statistics about the block, but people seem to be losing the general narrative here that like these are actually people who are interacting. The validator is interacting and selling you block space as a user, and that's the interaction that we need to focus on. Is like I am a buyer of block space as a transaction sender, and there's this other participant, this other individual in the market, right, who is the actual block producer, and we're not. This EMA proposal kind of assumes that markets behave as like a hive mind, right? That everybody agrees on a price at some time. And that's never the case, actually, right? I may get a completely different price, and I should if some block producer doesn't like my transaction, right? Like they don't think that they can execute it in a reasonable amount of time, or it costs them more to run the transaction. Another important consideration is they may think that the network can't execute it in time, or that it will make their block, less profitable, right? So it's important that we consider that there's this interaction that's extremely nuanced, right, between the buyers and sellers. And this is already this is something that's solved in traditional markets, and it's been that way for a millennium. I don't know. You have buyers and sellers, you have barter markets, and all that, and it's continued on through to modern day. So why mess?
Isn't the complication that there's no real mempool here? Like it's kind of hard to really reason about how the validators should think about accepting which transactions and which ones to not accept, etc.
I think that's definitely part of the issue is that right, you can think about these things as a streaming auction, right? Ethereum, for example, their auction is also streaming. Actually, you guys had Eugene, and he used this terminology too, where he said that there's this kind of streaming auction that's going on, right? What you have to realize is that you need to have, if you don't have a bunch of transactions in front of you before that auction has happened or started, right? You're not going to be able to price things out super well, right? But you can start to look at other things, right? Look at historical blocks. Look at other, like what's the transactions that I saw when I was last leader. There's a lot of data that you could look at to price out transactions, and I don't think the block producers are necessarily doing all of that just yet.
This might sound obvious, but what is the end goal for like this proposal, for example, that we're asking about? Like, who is seeing the benefit of this positive outcome that could be created? Is it, and I kind of want to make an analogy here that if you're in Ethereum land versus Solana, there's often this comparison that in Ethereum, the costs are put on the user with high gas fees, where in Solana, the costs are put on the validators because it's higher hardware cost. I'm curious, in this situation with what we're trying to improve here, who's the benefit going towards? Is it the developers or is it the users?
I think it will be the users. The users will be one of the benefits here. There's a lot, especially in like the DEX markets. There's just a ton of spam. We did a study like a year ago, and basically like 99% of arbitrage transactions fail. 58% of compute is spent on executing these failed arbitrages, and it's just really cheap to like keep spamming these things, and there's not really any economic back pressure here. So I think if you start to back pressure these bots to where it's like instead of 1/100th of a penny, maybe it's like 1/10 of a penny or something like that, then it kind of closes the window on like the profitability for ARBs. Like anytime someone trades, if they're creating any arbitrage opportunity that's over 1/100th of a penny, there's going to be an arbitrage transaction that immediately follows that. So if you're bumping up the fees a little bit on these super hot things, it kind of creates less arbitrage here. I think also the network will benefit as well. Like there's some, if that Solana is burned, then that will kind of benefit users of Sol as well. It's not quite the like, I don't think there's an emphasis on like the ultrasound money piece here, but it's just a piece of it that helps out.
Just to add a few cents there, it's going to be better for the users, just because, like, if as a user, sometimes, let's say I'm on Jupiter and there's a big airdrop, I submit it and maybe it doesn't make it to the blockchain. That's because maybe the leaders are overwhelmed, or it just keeps being forwarded until it expires. And so, it's going to be better, because today there was so might as well just talk about this. Today there was a when airdrop, or like, wasn't an airdrop, it was just like a claim, kind of almost for like the new standard that Jupiter is doing with bridge split. And I actually think the network performs better than before, in terms of, I think, ecosystem readiness, especially. Like, basically what happened was, Jito kind of did the airdrop, and like literally nobody was ready and nobody had fees on, and everybody was just kind of spamming, and nobody it wasn't obvious which transactions would work. And then now it's becoming more and more predictable. Of course, it's always going to be somewhat stochastic here, because the scheduler is relatively subpar in implementation until 1.18. But anyway, so Liam, you had some takes on kind of the network jitter that we've seen in the past, let's say, month or maybe 2 months, and now we're going to be seeing more airdrops. I can see like 3 or 4 coming in the next month. Can you maybe explain for the audience why this network jitter is happening and what's being done about it?
Well, so we could talk about jitter, but it's also important to talk about what the downstream effect of that is, right? And so the jitter comes from a few things, right? Jitter is just kind of this general thing that, in I don't know if it's computer science or we call it networking or what, where it takes a certain amount of time from, it may be that on average, the amount of time it takes for me to get something, a transaction landed, a message from me to you, takes a certain amount of time. Typically, maybe, hopefully, that average or that mean time is deterministic. But the deviation we would call jitter, right? And so that jitter ends up, if it's large enough, right? And in some cases in Solana, that when you're sending a transaction, that can be the case. A sophisticated actor like a bot or someone trying to do arbitrage or things like that will not be able to land deterministically, or at least not necessarily deterministically, but with better certainty, right? And the way this ends up playing out is that when you have jitter, right, you end up the transaction gets placed kind of more randomly within the block, right? Or more, as well as your priority fee ends up getting you into the leader at a later time, which ends up resulting in you placing later in the block, which was not your intention, right? What ends up happening is now, it's about a probability distribution, right? Of how probable is it that I will land if I send n transactions, right? Because the priority fee seems to break down when there's a lot of market, or when there's a lot of like activity in the actual in the network, right? What happens is that people will send n transactions, and so the currency then becomes how many transactions can you send, not priority fee, right? You'll send 5 transactions because you maybe know your probability of successfully landing is 20%, right? And especially when, right, the fee markets break down. So it's like, let's say, tomorrow there was, we all started using beads instead, right? Instead of dollars or something. It's the same sort of thing. If the market breaks down for dollars, then we'd go to some other thing, right? Same thing here. The market breaks down, people resort to some other current form of currency, and that's just sending a lot more transactions.
That's a good answer. Lucas, I'm curious how Jito comes into play here and how you look at this, because like Liam was explaining, right now you have an incentive just to almost spam the network, because you can use latency versus paying a fee to actually land that arbitrage. Once that scheduler improves and we have these updates, then it moves latency to actually using a fee to get placed in the position that you want, and that leads to Jito. So one, I'm just curious, if the scheduler gets fixed, is that huge for Jito? Because that should direct traffic potentially to you. And yeah, I'm curious about your thoughts on the situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think it will. I think that Jito would be useful before and after this, and we're seeing a lot of activity right now on Jito. Jito basically makes this fully, or not fully, but way more deterministic in that you only need to send one bundle or transaction to Jito, and Jito kind of has its own scheduler that we run, which basically takes other factors into account other than the priority fee. And I guess this may be just the implementation detail of Solana, but there's no way to like dynamically tip or have like a dynamic fee to validators in Solana. I put out a proposal for this. I think it's 10SMD 109, I think. But basically, there are traders that are willing to pay more if you guarantee them access to block space, and even like the ordering within the block. So they can send to Jito once, and there's kind of most searchers are doing dynamic tips where they will say, "Oh, I arbitrage this thing. My program detected I arbitrage this thing for 100 SOL. I'll give the leader 10 SOL if they guarantee me this opportunity." And we kind of filter out the stuff and do the simulation for the leaders and send them the profitable trades. So basically, somewhat prevents the spam problem. Currently, like almost 52% of stake is running the Jito client, so it's not 100% today. But yeah, I think to answer your question, I think that there will be use cases for Jito even when the new scheduler is implemented.
Quick question on that though. I know that Jito has more than 50% of the stake, or more than 50% of the stake is using the Jito MEV client. But how many ARB transactions do you think are actually going through Jito versus just going through, base layer?
Oh, it's a good question. I'll look into that. We were kind of rewriting our like database, so it's easier to figure this stuff out. But I mean, I don't have the answer for the number of transactions, but for the fees that are getting paid, the fees that are getting paid to leaders through the tips are much higher than priority fees. So I think it's like this week so far, there's been almost $1 million paid to validators through Jito and stakers through Jito tips.
That's awesome.
It's much lower for priority fees.
Nice. I want to now. So we covered briefly the boring stuff, the network problems, and some of the low level stuff. Let's talk about some of the high level stuff that our audience will hopefully understand more. So Liam, sticking to objective facts and as least speculation as possible. A lot of people still don't quite understand what Firedancer is and what it aims to do. Obviously, you're on the team. You have a better idea of this than anybody else. Can you briefly describe what Firedancer is, what it aims to do, and yeah, we can go from there.
Well, so Firedancer is just a blockchain client, and it is being built here in-house at Jump. And as we've talked a lot about, and Kevin Bowers, who's the head of this whole project, has talked about a lot. Like, one of the things that was noticed early on in the kind of planning phase and the coordination kind of phases for this whole project was that like this thing ends up looking really similar to a lot of the stuff that Jump's really good at, their bread and butter. And so it was kind of like it was kind of a match made in heaven, because we kind of could use a lot of the expertise, pull in a lot of the resources, and also it's something that we care about a lot. A lot of the folks here are like actually want to see Solana succeed. They're interested in if not interested in blockchain necessarily, like find this project fascinating because there's a lot of problems that are not something that they'll get in like another kind of space, right? A lot of the problems that Jump has to solve are ones of like latency, whereas these blockchain problems are bandwidth problems, right? Instead of being a latency first kind of problem solving approach, there's this kind of bandwidth first approach. This isn't really answering necessarily the question, but more as to why. But I guess more to what we're it's a blockchain client. We're building this client for Solana, all out in the open, and the intent is to be high performance. We've published a lot of stuff and talked to Breakpoint a lot about where we're at with that, and yeah.
Okay, Mert, I'm gonna butt in for the people that are like me that aren't super technical. All right, so everyone has like a general framework. Liam or Lucas, either one of you, can you explain just the difference between like what a client is and then say like this SVM? So can you kind of define, it's like there's multiple implementations versus like, specs. Can you explain that? And then like one just like question that if this is so important, why don't we just throw like 50 people to work on this? Just the resources, or what's the issue there?
That's not how engineering works.
Yeah. Well, exactly. This is for the non-techies. Because to me, like Firedancer is the hottest narrative in Solana right now. And it's like, oh, it could improve performance from 2 to 10 times, whatever it might be. It's that important. So yeah, I think Mert just said it. Why don't you just throw more resources at it? But can you start with just the general question of explaining what a client is?
So yeah, a client is basically, it's a software package, or it's, a bunch of code that speaks this language of the blockchain. Every blockchain has some language that it talks, and all these pieces of software communicate with each other. So if you send a transaction through Phantom or Solflare or any other app on Solana, there is a part of the protocol of the Solana blockchain is the transaction should have this layout to them. There's like these addresses that you interact with. There's these programs, and use instructions to talk to these programs, and all the way down to like the virtual machine. Like, how do I write code for this blockchain? How does the code compile? How does it handle? I don't know. Like, if you're doing math, how is it handling this math? And so a client is basically a piece of software that implements this logic in a perfect world to a spec. There's not currently a spec for Solana, but if you compare something to like Ethereum, there's clearly a Ethereum specification. There's the Ethereum virtual machine, which has a specification to it and how it handles operation codes and things like that. And so that's basically like a client. So you could, in theory, like there's like the Solana Labs client, which is written in Rust. Firedancer is working on one in C, and basically doesn't really matter that the code is like 1-to-1. What matters is that like the core pieces of the specification are met, so that when you send a transaction to the Solana Labs client or the Firedancer client, or the one being written in Zig, that the syndicate team's working on, or JitoSOL, they all know how to interpret it. When you process those transactions, they all come to the same result, and they kind of propagate that state out in some format that meets the specification.
Quick break to tell you about an upcoming event I promise you don't want to miss. It's Blockworks' biggest and best institutional conference called DAS London. It's a 2-day event happening in London this March, where we're going to have over 700 institutions, 130 speakers, and a couple thousand of us all under one roof. Crypto is in a position for the first time to actually onboard these institutions, and they're showing up. We have companies from BlackRock to Visa launching real products in the space. We have the real world asset narrative taking off. We have things like payments that have been exponentially growing. And then we have things like DePIN happening in the Solana ecosystem. There's a ton of capital right now in this institutional space. It's going to be coming on chain. It's going to completely change the industry. Whether you are an institution or you're a retail user, or you just want to learn more about what's going on in the space, this conference is for you. You're going to be able to meet some of the best and smartest people in the space. The speaker lineup's absolutely incredible, and you'll get to hang out with me. But the best part is you actually get 10% off your ticket if you use Lightspeed 10 when checking out. I put a link in the show notes. I recommend buying this today because 1, you'll forget about it. 2, these ticket prices go up every single month. So anyways, I hope to see you there. Now let's get back to the show.
So I want to get back to Jump and Firedancer. With this new Validator client, right? It seems like the goal is basically, or at least this is how Tolya describes it, which is the first version of the client is like, okay, we're engineers, we're going to ship something to production, and then we're going to fix the airplane while it's still flying. But then now Jump gets to look at this and says, okay, there's clear problems here, and you're not really under fire, or at least you're not under the same kind of fire. And now you get to kind of rebuild the system, learning from some of the mistakes that the labs client made, and basically try to squeeze as much performance from as the software allows you to get out of the hardware as humanly possible. And that results in, ideally, some sort of high performance or maybe lower hardware requirements. Now, people don't really know what to expect when it actually goes live. There's obviously a lot of different scenarios possible, and I don't want to speculate too much, but like, what do you hope happens when Firedancer goes live, when the project is, let's say, in mainnet by X years?
So my main hopes are that, well, I mean, we're going to spend a lot of time testing prior to that eventual date, right? So my hope is that we first provide a client that's works. I think there's a huge. It sounds silly, but like literally, like it, just would be great to just have a client that works, and we could put that out there into the world, because it's there's obvious value. I think most people could see why there's obvious value to having two clients. It would make the network more resilient. And so, sorry, Lucas, I know some people like to say that the Jito client is a totally different second implementation.
Oh, it's okay.
But I will unfortunately not give you that, not today at least.
Yeah.
I think there's obviously a resiliency aspect to it. And certainly when both clients are operating the same network, you kind of have to operate for you have to kind of operate at the performance of the least common denominator, right? So the guy running the node and, I don't know, name a place that's really far away, right? And in a machine that's completely underpowered and with the client that performs the worst, right? And so, given that that's the case, right? That'll be the first. I think that's most certainly what it will look like, I think, then at that point. But I will also note that even if Firedancer does provide, some improvement in performance or lower hardware requirements, even if it does, Solana Labs is making a lot of performance improvements, and people are actually noticing that. I think Triton pushed out something saying that, their hardware, their CPU usage, was down drastically in 117 or something to this effect. And so it's clear to me that while we are building this out, Solana Labs is also building out and stepping back and also doing similar performance improvements, right?
So that's interesting because Lucas, you guys have your own client for obviously MEV for purposes, and one thing that's probably something you're actually still thinking about is how will you guys think about your version of the client once Firedancer goes out? What do you think happens to the MEV landscape as we get closer to that date?
Yeah, I think that Firedancer is open source. We've been keeping an eye on it, how it's evolving. I think it's still too early for us to kind of take a look at it. But I think once there's more code written and open that is more relevant to the pieces that we hook into, I think we will start to take a look at it and figure out how to integrate. My gut is it will be much easier to integrate than the Solana Labs client. The Firedancer client consists of, correct me if I'm wrong here, but there's multiple tiles, which are basically multiple processes. The Solana Labs client is just one giant process. So it makes it much harder to kind of hook into the Solana Labs client, where a Firedancer client, we could spin up another process or maybe make a few changes to the process that handles the scheduler and block packing and hook in anything that's relevant there. I think that I think when it first comes out, there probably won't be that much impact on what we do. I think on a much longer time horizon, it's interesting to think about, like, what if Solana's doing, what if like Anatoly's vision does come true and like this is like actually like something that does compete with NASDAQ. with the latency and throughput. It's definitely interesting to think about. I think current pieces of our system need to change and adapt to that world. And yeah, there's definitely going to be changes if the network's operating at like sustained 10,000, 50,000, 100,000 TPS. Not saying that like Firedancer or the Solana Labs client will be able to handle that, but I think that's the dream on like a multi-year time horizon. Also, I wanted to go back to one of your questions earlier too. I think we kind of talked about like the resiliency of why Firedancer, and I guess to break it down for people, like why this is important. I think we actually saw this recently with the Ethereum network. I think one of the minority clients, can't remember which one off the top of my head, there's basically a bug in the client, and a part of the Ethereum network went offline for maybe like a few hours or something. And basically, because Solana Labs is like the only client, Jito Solana, maybe it's not client, it shares like 99% of the code with the Solana Labs client. If there's a bug there, then that has potential to take the entire network offline. And so if there's multiple clients that are written a little differently, like Firedancer isn't a copy paste, like let's just take this Rust code, translate it directly to C and, call it a day. It's like a ground up rewrite, new algorithms. So basically if there's a client and one bug, hopefully it doesn't impact the network. And also there's a big security piece to it as well. So like Solana Labs client, it's importing all these libraries. In the worst case, there's like some attack or piece of bug that happens to this library, or maybe Solana is using like some random crate or like a piece of code that they're importing that is used somehow in consensus, and that piece of code changes the way that behaves, and now there's like a weird bug that happens, and the goal is, security. I think Firedancer isn't really importing that many packages. It's writing a lot by themselves. That will be like thoroughly tested. So the goal is that if there's like a bug in one, then hopefully it doesn't impact the whole network.
Yeah, I think that's, at least for me personally, that's the most interesting part, which is you're reducing the probability of catastrophic failure because there's two things that are trying to do the same thing with different implementation. And so that's what I look forward to. But, a lot of people seem to think that this will eliminate all future outages, which is kind of, in my view, totally wrong. And one of the questions this opens up is, assuming a world where Firedancer is live, I think Toli has the idea that, well, like the top performing validators will kind of run both and then will fail over in case of some issue. Do you guys agree with that? Like, because this has opened a lot of questions on Ethereum, like, because if you have an activity leak and you're on kind of the wrong client, kind of money just, goes in the air. Solana doesn't have an activity leak. It's as much of a problem. How should we think about client diversity with respect to security and liveness when this goes live?
So I think, so Toli's idea, when he first mentioned it, like, I had a lot of issues with it, right? For one, I have a lot of issues with a lot of things Toli says, at least at the outset, because they just come out and they're straight. But in this case, after, I got the principle down, it makes sense. But my issue with it was that, I don't want people running, Firedancer's made to kind of, and many validator clients are really made to be run as kind of the primary application running on a particular machine or whatnot. And so I don't really want Solana Labs mucking about in the same box as Firedancer. And for performance reasons, right? Like the two clients take advantage of different parts of the operating system, and they'd actually just mutually, if you ran them on the same box, they'd just not perform well. You want to put them on different boxes. So once I got over that hurdle, right? Great. The two different machines. Now, you run these two clients, they're checking each other's results. And, Firedancer, for example, has an issue, which I'm going to be honest, like, I think that's not like it. Solana's complicated, right? So like I don't think it's unrealistic to hit a scenario, and I would much rather like build our client to do this failover process of, hey, we had a failure, let's gracefully, quickly switch back over to labs, right? I'd much rather, while we're in that transition period where we're starting up, we're coming up on mainnet, I'd much rather be built for that rather than saying, well, we're perfect. Like that's just not going to be the case. We're going to find all sorts of fun bugs, and we're going to sort out like as many of them as we can before we hit production. But to assume that we won't exactly reproduce every single transaction that Solana will send day one. And this is not to say, I'm saying that these failures would be like, oh, we can't, like we processed a transaction, Solana Labs thought it failed, we thought it succeeded, right? Fail back over to Solana Labs, right? They're right. Not that, oh, there's like some, vulnerability. I more mean just like, we want to make sure that we're replicating labs perfectly. And so we'll probably, we would fail over in that kind of case. Does that make sense?
I think I had the same reaction. I think the hard part I think will be is if I think at first people will, there may be some people that run both, or maybe those operators that are feeling a little more comfortable with operating a client like Firedancer and are willing to kind of chew glass if there's any issues. Maybe they'll operate one, and hopefully the network can transition slowly. I think my concern is operating Solana hardware is already expensive. So if now you're like the socially accepted practice is running 2 boxes, like how many people can actually afford to do that? What does that do to like the break even amount of stake that you need? But maybe there will be like people that are like, okay, I like what you're doing. I'm going to stake Solana to you guys because I like this and I think it makes sense for the network. And I guess it's ultimately like up to what stakers want to do. I think on a longer time horizon, I think it's a little unclear. As you mentioned earlier, Solana Labs is kind of built as a plane was flying, and they're kind of building it and patching holes and whatnot as the plane's flying. And I think the Firedancer team kind of has this opportunity, and they're definitely leveraging this opportunity. It's like, okay, let's zoom out super big. What are the pieces? How do we most efficiently use the hardware and write software to do what the current client does? And it will, I'm guessing that it will be much more efficient from basically every metric available than the Solana Labs client. And then once it's like stable, for some definition of stable as determined by like the operators and stakers, then there's going to be like, okay, I'm using like 10% of my CPU on this box running Firedancer. If we like 5x block capacity, I can make a lot more money. But if we do that, then maybe the Solana Labs client can't keep up with that. And so I think that will be an interesting fork in the road to, ultimately it's like proof of stake. People can stake where they want. So I guess it'll be up to the stakers, and maybe they'll be guided by engineers and people that understand the software well. But I'm sure like Solana Labs is, as Liam mentioned, like their 117 is much more efficient. There's no reason to believe that won't keep getting more efficient. And there's probably places where like if there's inefficient pieces of the lab stack, they can plug in Firedancer stack to kind of get some more performance there. But yeah, I think on like once it's been running and people are like, okay, I'm ready to make more money with this thing, we're hitting capacity, can we increase the block space by like 2 or 3 or 10x or whatever it is, then it's like, okay, are people going to run both? And like, is the Solana Labs client just going to be like hundreds of blocks behind because it's trying to like chug through all this stuff? And that's where it gets a little murkier.
So we talked about, at a high level, what we're talking about here is optimizing the living hell out of the client to get as much performance as possible on the L1. And if you zoom out a little bit, many people, probably the majority of the industry, doesn't actually agree with that approach, right? They will say, well, the L1's job is not that. Maybe it's mostly for consensus. making running full nodes as accessible as humanly possible, even if the incentives aren't there. And then maybe there's data availability that we must consider. And then let's offload the execution to the L2s. And then Solana is kind of saying like, okay, fine, but we're going to do this way. Liam, I want to start with you. Why do you think, because obviously, presumably you're working on this because you believe in scaling the L1 more than the alternative. Why do you think that's the right approach?
Well, I think, if we're going to talk about, as compared to Ethereum, the whole point of the roll-up thesis and the L2 thesis was that this gets us scaled to where we need to be so that they could have done sharding, right? And so and then eventually do, the full dank sharding, and then all of, then you have this zero knowledge, beautiful landscape where you have not infinite scale, but like you have way more scale in theory than any individual or any like it would scale a lot better than Solana at least in glorious future where we have hardware for zero knowledge. But that's just taking a lot longer than I think anybody expected or signed up for. And so kind of there's this, I think people have accepted that that's now the thesis is L2. And so I kind of, at least personally, I saw this coming, way, way earlier and kind of decided, hey, this whole L1 thing, right? We just have to, we just got to sit down and rewrite some of these guys, and maybe we'll have like an actual thing that we can actually scale to, something that, can run multiple major applications, right? If the question is kind of like, one, why would I do this? I think it's really that like, it's all about the fact that like, hey, there's like, the goal was actually with all of these things was to eventually go back to the L1 and do everything on, with the zero knowledge stuff and all the vertical trees and all that craziness, right? So wait a second, like, why don't we just work on the L1 thing all at once? And that's why that was a big motivator for why I ended up joining Firedancer.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's tried anything before. I feel like everyone just kind of like throwing up their hands and they're like, oh, this like won't scale. And so we're just going to like create these systems that will scale but take massive like shortcuts, or they tend to compromise in like certain areas like decentralization. Obviously, I'm very biased in Solana. Have spent the last like 3 years of my life thinking about Solana basically every day. And so I feel like there's a lot more juice to squeeze out of this. I think we're also seeing this with like Ethereum too. Like the Paradigm team in Georgia is building Reth and making that very fast and very efficient. And like, what if people spent all this time focusing on L1s and trying to maximize that versus building all this L2 infra that compromises on like some of the things that we came here for in the first place.
Well said. I'm curious how you square that with the idea. I was listening to a podcast yesterday and Tarun was on it, so I have no idea if this is accurate or not. But one of his points was Ethereum obviously moves pretty slow, and they have a reason for a lot of that. One reason he said is also because you have 4 client teams at least that are trying to like work on these upgrades together, because at the end of the day, they have to be able to work with each other. Do you see, let's just assume that Firedancer doesn't become the only client in Solana. Let's assume there's more than one. Let's say there's like 3 to 4. Does that slow down the pace? How does that slow down the pace of development? So like one real question would be like the scheduler. Would this affect how quickly that scheduler could roll out? Because Tarun's example is like billions of dollars of equity value has appeared out of Ethereum moving slow. And by that, he's talking about Celestia, for example. He's like, if you only had one client, maybe they could already have dank sharding. And instead of Ethereum capturing that value, now you have all these companies popping up. So I'm just curious, like, how do you see that playing out in Solana?
It's definitely going to slow things down. I think that has been Solana's superpower up until now. Having a single client. They've been able to move extremely fast. There's kind of like less stakeholders involved. Like ultimately, client teams have a lot of say in what happens. And also like when you get more people involved and stuff, to your earlier point, like why not throw 50 engineers at it? It's like, what's the saying? Like 9 women can't make a baby in 1 month. Like stuff engineering doesn't work like that. I don't think anything works like that. So I think it will slow things down, but I think also like if you get the right people involved Solana is a very engineering focused chain. There's been a lot of like rigorous engineering involved with it today. That's only if you want to build a Solana client, you have to be like partially crazy, but also like very talented as an engineering team. And so I think that while it might slow things down, I think that if you get the right teams involved, it can potentially speed things up. And I could definitely see that happening with Solana. I think, at least talking to some people at Firedancer, there's like a few things in the protocol where it's like, oh, if we like switch to this algorithm that the labs team like they weren't aware of it, or maybe maybe they weren't aware of that. This like new algorithm that leverages hardware with like 4x efficiency, then maybe you can maybe that will actually speed things up because you end up going down like less rabbit holes.
Yeah, I'll give my my piece on this. So I'll tell you right now, Solana's development and like this pace of things is already slowed down. And not necessarily so like things like the scheduler, those scheduler improvements actually only affect really the individual clients, right? I could write my own. Actually, today, Garrett, if you really wanted to, you could go and replace the scheduler yourself, right? And it wouldn't break anything. It would just change how, when you're the leader, you build blocks, right? So, totally, a lot of things like that are doable today. Where like it's performance improvements, and again, they're shipping those without us. We don't have to, be a part of that. They just ship these performance improvements, right? There are some fundamental things that like, okay, these are part of the protocol. We have to go back and change them. And that kind of stuff has slowed down a lot, but not in like, not in a bad way, more in like, okay, let's sit down and really think about the problems, right? Because like we want to make a very precise small change. Solana is actually a really quite good protocol, right? Things like the account model make a lot of sense. Things like the the way the virtual machine SVM is kind of laid out largely makes a lot of sense. And so like there are pointed things now where we're like, okay, there was a proposal about the half the priority fees being burned right now. That makes no sense. That's a pretty pointed kind of proposal. Let's go and fix that. Or there are sometimes there are a few things that we're kind of holding on to now where it's like, oh, there's this little kind of esoteric thing that's right over here that everybody has to do. But if we didn't have to do it, it would give us back like, 10% or 20% in this one part of the whole kind of picture of the performance picture, right? So we're doing a lot of that. And then also with the bigger stuff, they're also, stepping back and saying, okay, but how does this now affect another client? And I think at least what I've heard from some people from labs is that that's really helping them sit down and really think about the design and the implementation and how that just kind of is it generally a good idea to do this thing? Is it generally a good, does this help? Are there other reasons why, doing X actually helps the network other than just, patching something that's not working well, right?
I think you just answered this, but is there any reason for the teams in Solana to be slower with upgrades just because it pushes out the runway for you working at Firedancer? Because I'm assuming all these upgrades you have to introduce as well.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's a big part of it, right? So there was a point where they were adding like new feature gates and new features that were change consensus on a fairly regular basis, and we've now caught up to most of them. But there was a joke running around in our team that at least once a month there would be a new hash algorithm or some new cryptography thing that they just pull in a crate for. We have to go and get Kevin Bowers, or the cryptography guys, and to come and rebuild it up from scratch. And so like that's all kind of slowed down now, and it seems like it's letting labs focus on these performance things, which seem to like performance is TPS is a feature, right? So I think it's great, especially when the protocol is kind of in a good spot, excluding fees and a few other kind of minor little minutia, things seem to be like kind of in a good state. And it seems like at least that's my impression.
Lucas, this is a quick one for you, just because as I'm listening to this conversation, it popped up in my head. And I bet a lot of people listening are thinking the same thing. We were talking about like whose responsibility is it that we have multiple clients? Like should apps actually run more than just one client, like Firedancer and Labs, for example? And then my mind jumps to Jito, because so many people run Jito, and you now have JitoSOL, which is the staking product, which reminds me of Lido, which the Ethereum community is putting a lot of pressure on them to choose the correct, whatever they think correct is, validators. And that could be validators that use certain clients so that you have diversity, a lot of responsibilities on that team. I'm curious how you think about it, but I want to frame it as on Solana, there's only a 5% staking rate, or liquid staking rate. So it's not like much of that's actually under Jito, but yeah, I'm curious what you think about that right now.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, it's up to Jito governance to decide these things. I don't really have like a say in it. I guess my personal take is that I think if JitoSOL continues to grow, I think it will become more important. I guess right now it's mainly like Jito Solana or Solana Labs. They're essentially very similar, like 99 or 98% of code shared. I think when Firedancer goes live, it will be interesting. Keep coming back to Stakenet, but Stakenet has the ability to track these things on chain. And so that's something that if someone feels strongly about it, they can go and make a governance proposal like, hey, there's the Jito Solana client, the Solana Labs client, Firedancer, SIG, like we should, right now the delegation algorithm does X when taking into account validator clients. We think it should change to where it's like 1/3 each, or we think that you could go the opposite direction and like we'll take whatever one pays more. So it's kind of just like it's up to governance to decide. But I do think that as more clients come online on like a multi-year time horizon, looking at like 2, 3, 5 or more years, you need to take into account the validator client that's running on the liquid staking protocol. The cool thing about Solana with staking is that it's all delegated, so you can kind of like pretty easily move stake around to new operators that are running certain clients.
While we're on the topic of staking, I do want to quickly touch on one of the most common criticisms of Solana, which is sustainability, let's say, of validators. And Lucas, you're probably the best person on the network to answer this. First, I'm curious to get your thoughts on kind of that criticism. I'm sure you know what it is. I know you guys also have, and like I know that whenever I post like a chart of the priority fees, you'll also like post like the MEV fees, and you're like, well, Jito is also doing quite well and enabling validators to earn more. And then you also have something called Stakenet that I know you guys released recently, or at least you finally wrote about it. So thank you for that. So if you want to just also talk about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of things that are happening that will make validator profitability better. One is the thing that Liam suggested earlier, where 100% priority fees go to the validator instead of this like 50-50 burn thing. That should help a little bit. That's just like a good change in general to have. It's more encourages less like side channel payment, but also it just makes validator profitability better. They're earning 50% more. There's definitely a long way to go for transactions. Solana can handle like whatever, like 5,000 or 10,000 transactions per second. That's not the actual demand. It's much lower. So getting more activity happening on Solana will help a lot. There will be more priority fees involved with this more activity. And if there's dynamic base fees, then some piece of that will be burned, which somewhat helps the price of Solana. Unclear how much that will help. But and then I think also like we've seen this play out on Ethereum. I think it's still pretty early on Solana, but MEV is like might be a controversial opinion, but I think it's like is as a block producer, you kind of are able to build the block however you want. your main motivation is profitability. That's like one of the main value captures for L1 tokens. Eventually, L2 tokens will follow. We're seeing a lot of protocols take MEV into account now, and I think that MEV will like continue to play an increasing role in validator economics. And yeah, I think over time the inflation rate goes down, so there needs to be something else that kind of accounts for that in increasing profitability.
And then Lucas, you guys at Jito announced Stakenet. Can you talk a bit more about that? I know it opens the room or the conversation up for restaking, which is a hot topic. So curious how you would describe it to just other people who are not familiar with it and how to think about it.
Yeah. So when we were originally designing Stakenet, is mainly the focus on liquid staking tokens, and to dumb it down the dumbest way possible, I think you can basically compare it to like there's a brain that operates these liquid staking protocols. Right now, this brain is off chain. It's running on some like GCP server, AWS, or whatever. And that brain has like eyes and ears, and it's pulling this data from APIs and RPCs and all this stuff. And so that brain is pretty centralized. The main motivation behind Stakenet is basically moving this brain on chain and moving as much of the eyes and ears and like sensing ability for this brain on chain as well. So for the eyes and ears, we have the Validator History program. If you go to jito.network/Stakenet, you can see the data that these eyes and ears are collecting. The brain is currently, it's like wrapping up brain surgery right now, but basically like figuring out how to run a stake pool. How do you, like one thing that we're working on now is like, how do you avoid like churning stake pools? If you're like constantly redelegating, then you're losing yield on that. And how do you kind of prevent these this constant churning, but also like long tail scenarios where like something happens and there's like a mass destaking event from the stake pool. And yeah, I was like thinking about it over the past few weeks, and I think that it can be much more generalized to not include liquid staking protocols, but basically anything where you want to like allocate resources across some network of like nodes. One potential use case for that could be restaking. There's probably other use cases as well. Like, hey, there's like these things that are operating these networks, and there's some way to quantify their performance and decentralization and whatever other characteristics you care about. And maybe there's ways that this like putting this brain on chain can result in these networks being more decentralized and like autonomous, and so you don't have to get governance involved for every single like decision that you make. Because I think a lot of these restaking protocols on Ethereum, for instance, like there's going to be a ton of AVSs or like actively validated services that are running. And like, how do you choose which service that if you're a restaking protocol, you have all this staked Ethereum or liquid staking tokens, trying to decide like where do you allocate it. You could just say like, oh, we're just going to allocate it to these people, or hey, we're going to allocate it based on this governance vote. But I think that like autonomy and having this feedback loop for these protocols will be important. And so you can kind of run it off chain. The cool thing about Solana is that compute's so cheap, and you can blast like tens or hundreds of thousands of transactions on chain to kind of like update the eyes and ears and brain. And I think that there's some other like potentially interesting use cases for this in areas outside of liquid staking.
Stakenet is super cool. Lucas and Liam, I'm both curious, just like high level, what do you think of restaking? And Lucas, when I'm shilling Jito to people and I can talk about your liquid staking token, the MEV client, can I also now say that you're getting involved in restaking, or is that not a thing yet?
It's not a thing yet, but definitely researching it. I like how Mert went off camera during this.
He's like, this topic is not
like
for me.
no comment. But no, I think it's pretty interesting. I think a lot of the, like, when you look at restaking on Ethereum, there's just so much you can't really do on the base layer because it's so expensive. So there's like, it's kind of like the L2 thing where there's like all these like L2s popping up that do different things, and you have roll up as a service and co-processors and all this crazy stuff. It's just like, let's just like do this on Solana. Like, so it's, I think that's pretty cool. Like this like machine to machine communication layer on Solana. I don't think that, like, my personal take on restaking is, I think I don't hate it as a whole, but there's definitely going to be certain use cases that people probably shouldn't endorse. And hopefully people can like avoid those use cases or creating things that are like systemically risky. But I think that it's like very useful in certain contexts. Like if you need a lot of security on a network, then like being able to use liquid staking tokens or like staked assets of the L1 can be useful and kind of avoid potential death spirals of protocols if there's some issue that pops up.
You know, I haven't followed the restaking stuff as much. I know that there's a lot of that discussion on Ethereum as well. I will say this, and it's kind of my short answer to kind of a very complex question. And I think Lucas kind of was dancing around it. Is like, it turns out native staking is extremely powerful, and like it would be interesting to see if some other bigger networks also, decided that, hey, maybe like we should probably look at this because like it does enable a lot of other use cases that are very useful for internalizing onto the network or building L2s and things like that.
Yeah, I think one more point too that I'll add real quick is I think just because of the way Ethereum is built, I think restaking is like this very specific thing. But I think when you look at it on Solana, it has the potential to not, like if you build restaking on Solana, it doesn't have to be with staked SOL or like liquid staking tokens. Like at the end of the day, a lot of stuff's just like SPL token. So like you don't, if you build a network or like code that has restaking type logic where there's like these node operators and people are delegating to them and they're using some asset, it doesn't have to just be liquid staking tokens on Solana. It can be like other SPL tokens. Like you could use like USDC if you really wanted to. So I think that's pretty cool.
Let's end on a fun note and maybe more of a lizard brain note. I would like you guys to give one hot take or one hot prediction that you have for the year. It can be about anything within the context of crypto. And one thing you would like to see from the Solana network.
Try to think. This is a hard question because there's 1,000 things I could say. I could say them all. We'll be here till like 8 or 9 p.m. or something.
List it. Just do a whole rant.
I'll answer your second question first. What is the like my goal? My goal is that we actually see some of the Firedancer code outside of just like the use for Solana, the use for blockchain. There's like a lot of code in there that's like like we've got a really fast ED 25519, which is just a cryptography protocol, right? We've got one of the fastest ones there. That was what was demonstrated at Breakpoint. We've got a whole bunch of other really high performance things sitting in there that they're not going to see mainnet use on Solana for some time, but they're like some of the these are general purpose libraries. Anybody could pull them in. So it'd be cool to see those kind of, if someone wants to pull them into their project and, play around with them, they should. It's all open source. And so it'd be really cool to see that. I think my hot take, and I'm going to be really generous, actually. I think my hot take is that we're going to see a lot of really good work. And like I mentioned this before, but like we're gonna see a lot of really interesting performance work coming out of labs. I think people don't think, like some people are like labs, I used to think that like, labs, how did they get to this state? They'll never be able to fix it. It's all lost. It seems like I was very wrong. So I'm happy to be wrong about that. And I'm excited to see, and we're certainly like talking to them a lot about like, if you did this, it would fix a lot of stuff. And I think they're actually seeing that and like, we got to do this.
Nice. All that code, what's the license on the code for that, for Firedancer?
I think it is Apache. Yes.
Nice.
Apache.
Very cool. Cool. Yeah, my hot take is, I think Solana needs to focus, like the core protocol people and the foundation need to focus a lot more on MEV. I think it's going to become increasingly important on Solana, and they just need to be thinking about it much more than they are today. I think a lot of stuff on Solana was designed and when they didn't really know about MEV, like using like UDP, for instance, and people spamming 50 or 100 gigabits of transactions at these boxes during the NFT mints and arbitrage and that. Just like not really thinking about MEV or traders or people abusing the system. But I think, Quick, no matter what your feelings are on Quick are, I think you can say that it definitely improved the performance and, improved the performance and reliability of the network. Obviously, there's people have mixed feelings on Quick, but there's probably something in between just straight UDP, protocol-less UDP and Quick that can continue to address it. Yeah, the thing I'm looking forward to on Solana Network are just more people building on Solana, more people participating in hackathons and building products and protocols that can really drive the success of Solana. I think we're all like deeply, I guess we're all working on infra here, including Garrett with his new position coming up soon at Squads, and like the success of the Solana protocol is something that like we're heavily tied to. Mert, Liam, a lot of people are, even the DeFi protocols. And so I want to continue to see like really talented builders coming into Solana and starting to consider it more and starting to make Solana their home and build more tooling for like writing on-chain programs and testing and all of that stuff.
Very well said.
I do have one hot take, actually. Quick needs to die. If it doesn't die, like there's no hope. There's just no way we're going to be able to. I think there's definitely a mid-intermediate, but also like, if you're going to be a professional, you got to handle all the packets you're getting. And if you can't, then, you need to sit down and really think about your life and and consider your life choices and how you got to this point. So just handle all if you're a network engineer and you're listening right now, just handle all the packets. Or if you're working on a blockchain or you're doing something, figure out how you handle all the packets and then decide that you need a protocol to fix all that, because you don't actually need any of that. You don't need Quick. Yeah. That's it.
Yeah. Send this directly to Toli.
They're on board. We've said it so much at this point. We've just been screaming at Richie and all of us are like, Quick is not going to work. So I think they got the message.
Nice. I think it's a good way to end it. Lucas and Liam, thanks for coming on. Lucas, you were talking about bringing in talent to the ecosystem. Really do appreciate you guys coming on the podcast, because I think this is huge. Just the transparency, you guys talking, getting away from building the apps and the research forums for a bit. A lot of the other ecosystems just don't have that. And that's the only way people find out about Solana and what's going on. So guys, thanks for coming on. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, we'll see you next time. All right, I've got a little ending note here. First, thank you so much for listening to the full episode. If you really liked it, hit subscribe. But secondly, make sure you sign up for DAS. This is Blockworks' biggest institutional conference happening in London in March. I've included a link in the show notes and also a discount code. You get 10% off. Make sure to use Lightspeed 10 when you sign up. All right, I'll see you there, and I'll see you next time on Lightspeed.